I wanted to stay in the ministry because I had a prophecy that was given to me to go there, and I knew it hadn't been fulfilled.
Wow.
And if I hadn't have had that prophecy, we might have left, but that prophecy kept me there. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is showing up in the presence of fear. Instead of, cowering down, I stood up.
Hey there, I'm Matthew Foley, and this is ISOW Insights, where God's truth grows in the midst of current culture, renewing the mind and spirit. Well, we have Dr. Bryan Cutshall again here with a part 2. We're picking up where we left off last time we had him on board here. So I believe last time, where did we leave off from in your life story?
I'm not sure where we left off. I know we talked a lot about how I met my wife, how I got called to ministry.
I think it was that
the background where I grew up, those kinds of things.
The CEO who started the church, was it the family whose husband he preached to the church? I recall
my
that.
first church plant. I talked about where Faith and I we were engaged when I started planting the church, and so.
I remember, now I don't know how many years down the line this was, because we're going to be getting in today to Twin Rivers and to ISOW, and then from ISOW, I do want to talk to you about where you think the culture in America is. Some big questions, and what you would say to a younger you looking forward. But what we want to talk about now, I think if I can jump into this, I don't know how far ahead from Lee this was, but I remember you talking about an encounter you had with the some Satanists, to put it bluntly.
Yeah.
And this was at a small church, I remember.
Yeah, so this was in St. Louis, actually. So when I went to St. Louis, our church was running about 50 people. I think we had 52 was our average for the first month there. Our Wednesday nights were like 11, less than 15. And Sunday nights were about the same. So it was just a very small church. And all of a sudden, I started getting these notes on the church doors, always on a Saturday night.
Really?
Yeah. So they started off just posting these. They were written in magic marker, but they were like green magic marker or something like that, I remember. But they would put these notes on there to just kind of scare us, cursing and things like that were just scary. And then we started noticing other kinds of things in addition to that. They started, leaving things on my car. They would spray paint things, and it would look like vandalism at first. And so there was a policeman that attended our church, and I mentioned this to him, and he said, well, let me have some of the guys to look into it. Well, they realized that this had been happening in 5 other churches, and they were able to investigate it and found out that it was the Church of Satan that was doing it. They were sending out members to do this. It got to a point that they started leaving posters, and they would always come on a Saturday night, and they would leave posters, like big poster boards on the church doors, just, foul language and just judgment and like your day is coming.
They're really trying to ramp up the intimidation.
Yeah, threats, just fearful threats. Well, I'm 24 years old. We've got 2 little babies. I have a daughter at that time who was probably a year old, another daughter who's 3. And so this was terrifying. I mean, Faith and I never lived in Missouri. She's from Georgia. I was from Tennessee, and we just were far away, 500 miles from anyone we knew.
How common was that at that time in the church? Did you have people in areas like that threatening openly churches?
This was my first encounter, so I'm not really sure. I think that because we didn't have social media, we didn't even have internet. So you have to remember, the internet hadn't been invented yet. So because of that, you only heard about things on the news. Yeah. And you didn't have 24-hour news broadcast like we have now. There was no Fox News network 24 hours a day. You heard your news for about an hour a day, or morning or evening. So you only got about an hour of news, and you read the newspaper, and that was it.
Where did your mind go when this officer mentioned to you, this is the Church of Satan?
Well, obviously it was very fearful, and I knew they only came at night. And then it started happening. Other times they were knocking on windows. And so it got to a point that I felt like I needed to stay on guard. So I went on third shift. So Faith and the girls would sleep in our bed at night, and then I would walk the floors. I put a pistol on my side.
You were armed physically and spiritually.
That's
Take care of
right.
it,
A
yeah.
Bible in my hand and a pistol on my side, and I basically policed the house. I didn't go outside, but I'd peek through windows, and this went on for months. I don't remember exactly how long, but it was very scary. You know, my wife was afraid. We were afraid for our children, and then people started telling us we need to move, and and we were listening to them. We thought they were saying, kind of like Job's comforters, you're out of God's will.
Yeah.
God didn't send you here for that, because we hadn't been there very long. And so when all of this started happening, I just started staying up all night long, quoting scriptures and, walking through the house, just basically praying and reading the Bible. And I'd do this for hours, literally all night long, until the sun came up.
What was the reason? I mean, why would a 15-member church be a threat to this organization?
Well, we found out later. So let me progress this story kind of to my part of the end, and then how we found that out. So I finally got to a place that I was just tired of it.
Sure.
So I just decided to take a spiritual stand, and so I put my own note on the door on a Saturday night. And it was something simple like, I will meet you next week on the parking lot. Probably I was young, probably something like no cops or something like that.
Showdown.
That's exactly what it was. It was a showdown. Well, they took my note. And when they took my note, I knew that they had it. And so I prepared. I fasted. Faith and I fasted. Both of us did. The next week, I walked down to the parking lot at dark. And I didn't take a gun this time. It was just me and my Bible. And I was ready to face them off. I didn't know what God was going to do.
Why did you take your gun? I'm curious about that.
Why didn't I take my gun?
Yeah.
I don't know why I didn't. I thought that they wouldn't approach me. I think that if they saw that I was carrying a gun, plus I didn't have a permit.
Okay.
So, if they
Once you
break
left
in
the
someone's
building.
house,
Yeah.
that's one thing, but carrying a gun openly outside, and I didn't want to shoot anybody. I really wanted a spiritual showdown. So I walked the perimeter. I walked around the property, and it was a Saturday night. I did it all night long. And I never saw anyone. I mean, if they came around, they knew I was serious. They might have thought it was a trap. I didn't know what happened. But what I know is I walked like a Jericho march all night long around the property, praying in the Spirit, quoting scriptures. I probably looked a little crazy out there because I was desperate. My wife would peek out our house. They had a little parsonage, which was right beside of the church. So she could peek out the window just to see if I was alive, and I'd wave at her. So she didn't sleep at all that night.
I bet.
And this was a Saturday night. We had church the next day. I had to preach twice the next day. And so I did this all night long, and then still had to go to the pulpit. Well, I remember it was about 5:30 in the morning, and the sun started coming up. And I heard the voice of the Lord say to me, "Son, you've made it through the night."
Wow.
And that's all I needed. That one little phrase set me free. I never had another moment's fear about it. So when the Lord said that, I just began to rejoice, jump up and down, just rejoice, might have even run. I don't know. I was just so happy that I'd made it through the night. I realized that they didn't show up, but I did. And I also realized that Satan didn't show up, but God did.
Hallelujah.
And in
That's
that
amazing.
moment, I never had another moment's fear. They never put another note on my door. They never came back again. That was the end of it. It was like that showdown spiritual battle ended it. Our church began to grow. I was no longer operating in fear. I began to, with courage, lay hands on people and pray for them, which I was so intimidated. For those months, I wasn't doing any of that. I wasn't really ministering. I was surviving. And so after that, things really began to take off. So it was probably 2 years later, there was a young lady came into our church, and after the service, she sat through the service, and after the service, she said to me, you you don't know who I am, but I know who you are. And I thought that was kind of odd. And I said, well, how do you know me? And she said, I was a part of the Church of Satan when we were assigned against you. I was a part of the team assigned against you.
Whoa.
And she said, remember all those notes? And of course, I remembered it all. She said, I was one of those people doing that. And I said, well, why are you telling me this now? That's 2 years ago. And why did you guys stop? She said, well, the reason I'm telling you now is because I'm now a born again Christian. And I felt like it was my duty to come and tell you this. And I said, well, what was going on? Why were you guys targeting us, this small little church, no threat to the community? And this is what she said. I'll never forget it. She said it was for one reason only. You pray in tongues.
Oh, my goodness.
I said, what? She said, yes. She said, you pray in tongues, and the people of this church pray in tongues. And the church of Satan, this was her words, not mine, cannot operate within 5 miles of any congregation that prays in tongues. And she said, she said the church of Satan was wanting to move its headquarters from San Francisco, California to St. Louis, Missouri, to be in the middle of the country. But the piece of property they wanted was within 5 miles of your church and other churches, and we only targeted the 5 churches in this area that spoke in tongues. That was it.
That's incredible. Like 50 people congregation, 5 miles. It's like that was a spiritual battle over St. Louis.
I know. It definitely was.
At ISOW, we always strive to provide discounts and incentives for our students.
Now, we're thrilled to announce our best value ever, the ISOW All Access Pass.
For just $99 per month, any student can access our entire learning platform.
An ever-expanding library of fascinating, groundbreaking teaching at your fingertips for the average price of just one ISOW course.
There has never been such a prime opportunity to pursue your biblical education. Students in many traditional schools pay $100 to learn every day for every single course.
With the All Access Pass, that amount gives you access to our entire course catalog.
At ISOW, you can learn from world-class teachers on a wide variety of subjects, all at your own pace.
With the subscription-based model of the All Access Pass, there are no obligations to put yourself in debt for decades.
If you're hungry to learn about the Word, there's never been a better value.
That's countless hours of teaching and materials with no limit on how much you can learn. Now, more than ever, ISOW is excited to connect the Word with the world.
Go to isow.org to get started with the All Access Pass today.
The amazing thing about that story is that, after she told me that, she never came back anymore, so I don't even know her name. She just showed up that one time to let me know. But I was able to get in contact with the other Spirit-filled pastors in the area and tell them the story, because none of them knew what happened. One of them did leave. Out of the 5, one of them left, and the church collapsed. So they successfully eliminated one of the Spirit-filled churches in our area. It was a great church, an Assembly of God, and it just kind of fell apart. And so it was no longer in existence. Mm-hmm. But that really taught me a lesson about praying in the Spirit. It really taught me a lesson about spiritual warfare. And it's a much better story to tell than it was to live.
I believe it. But that was a weapon of intimidation. I know that Paul, when he says to Timothy, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of love, power, and a sound mind.
That's right.
He's basically talking about the intimidation that the devil tries to bring. And
that's right.
It's interesting that these people obviously were threatening. I think that there's a chance that with that group of people, they probably do make good on some physical threats that they make. But in this case, it's amazing that they didn't have the authority to do that to you. All they had were threats.
And I think that if I had not have responded, well, the Holy Spirit in me responded the way I did. Instead of, cowering down, I stood up. I was packing, but I stood up and fought.
Yeah.
And I think that's how you beat intimidation. That's how David defeated Goliath. He showed up at the battlefield, and I think that's what I did. Mm-hmm. Even though I didn't have enough experience to even understand, I was feeling my way through it, and I was terrified the whole time. but I did it. I think that's something that a lot of people need to know, is that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is showing up in the presence of fear. And I think that's what some people don't understand about courage. It doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you're afraid, but you're going anyway.
Wow. So the chances are David steps up to the lion, and he steps up to whatever comes against him. He steps up to Goliath, and he's probably not completely lacking the emotion in the moment.
His knees are knocking.
Yeah.
But he knows God, and he's trusting the Lord. And that was where I was at. I didn't know what was going to happen. I just wanted to protect my family. I wanted to stay in the ministry because I had a prophecy that was given to me to go there, and I knew it hadn't been fulfilled.
Wow.
And if I hadn't have had that prophecy, we might have left, but that prophecy kept me there.
Now, well, let's talk about that, because I wanted to ask, actually, what drew you and Faith to St. Louis to minister there?
We were called there. Yeah, nothing drew us there. We'd never been there before. And so I was, I have been an intercessor for my whole adult life. Even as a child, I was an intercessor. We didn't call it that back then. We called it prayer warriors.
Yeah.
So one of my practices was on Monday when I was pastor in a small church. So I was a youth pastor and a minister of music for 3 years. My whole ministry career is this. I planted that church in Knoxville, Tennessee that we talked about. Then I went out and pastored this small old country church that it was just an open door. I was ready to pastor. I'd been a youth pastor and a minister of music while I finished my college. And then I wanted to pastor, and that's the only thing that was open. So we took this little church running 18 people out in West Tennessee, and we were there only a little less than 2 years. But the church grew from 18 to over 200 people.
Wow.
Yeah, and we didn't even know why. If I had to guess why, Faith and I were both singers and musicians. They'd never had anything like that before.
Yeah.
And I think that culture loved good music.
And then weren't you busing in people from Lee too?
Well, that
So
was the church plant.
okay.
So
Yeah,
that was the one
church
in
plant.
Knoxville. So no, this one was out in West Tennessee.
So you're standing on your own 2 feet as musicians playing in that church.
Me and Faith, we found a guy who was a country music singer that got saved.
Oh, really?
And we brought him in as a trio, and we sang the daylights, man, out of that. I mean, out of those songs, and the people loved it, man. They loved it. I was just, I'd been an evangelist for a while, but I wasn't a deep preacher. But I was a passionate preacher even then. I mean, I would break a sweat even if I didn't have much to say. But I mean, I had a bachelor's degree, so it wasn't that I didn't have anything to say. But I don't know. We took that little church because it was an open door. But then when we saw what God did and how fast it grew, we had our second child while we were there, our daughter Lindsay. And that's when I decided I wanted more for my kids. I didn't want them raised in this tiny little town out in the country. I don't know, reminded me in many ways of how I was raised, and I just wanted them to have a better opportunity. So I wanted to go to a larger city, but I didn't know where. So I was out riding a horse on a Monday. I did that on Mondays when I could, and I would go up, I would ride to the top of this mountain and pray. So I'd ridden the horse up there, I'd tied him up, and I remember laying back on this moss at the top of this mound. I just laid back on it and kind of put my hands behind my head. And when I did, I had a vision, and I'd never had one before. It was the first time I had a vision. And the only vision what I saw in the vision was me with a horn of oil, like a bull's horn.
Wow.
And it was filled with oil. And I was pouring it in these sheep that looked bloody. They looked like they were old and had just been, tattered by wolves or something. And in this vision, I'm just pouring this oil on them and kind of massaging it into their wool. And there's only a few of them, maybe, I don't know, I'd say 8, maybe 6 or 8, not very big flock at all. And then all of a sudden, this little flock just began to multiply into thousands and thousands and thousands. And they literally filled up a whole valley as far as I could see. I was on a mountaintop when this happened. and it filled up a whole valley. And I heard a voice say, "You will not be able to number them."
Oh my.
That's all he said. "You will not be able to number them. There'll be so many." And I had no idea what it meant. I came home and I told my wife, and because I'd never had a vision before, and that wasn't really something that we were accustomed to.
Mm-hmm.
She kind of, yeah, well, that's good, very nice, kind of patted me on the back, and well, I'm glad God spoke to you. We didn't take it that serious. I mean, I did because I knew it was very real, but.
And when you say vision, I've heard a lot of people talk about mental images that are very strong and pressing. You mean
It was like
you saw it?
It was like a mini movie.
Wow.
Yeah, it was like I was watching a film, but I was in it, and it was the best I could describe it is like a daydream.
Mm-hmm.
So a night dream is very vivid, full of colors, and that's some people call those night visions, but a night dream. But this was just like that, but I was awake. But I closed my eyes just like this, and then it happened. It was just like it. If I had have known better, I would have thought that I instantly fell asleep and had a dream. It was that real, and it was that vivid. So, we kept pastoring that little country church, and I brought in an evangelist for a revival, and he was up preaching, and in the middle of his sermon, he turns around and looks at me, and it had that big bug-eyed look, that sometimes they get. And it's like, no, not me. And so he turned around and he said, "I don't know what this means, Bryan, but this is what I see. I see a horn of oil in your hand. You're pouring it on these battered sheep."
You're kidding.
And he said, and then they begin to multiply in a valley so large. I'd never told anyone this but Faith. He described my vision to a T. Then I get a call from the Church of God bishop in Missouri. He was looking for young people to come and work in the West. Mm-hmm. He had this old church, and this is what he said to me. His name was Wendell Smith. He called me up and he said, "Bryan, I know that you've had some successful growth there in West Tennessee. I'm looking for a sharp young couple like you guys that can do music. I got a little church here." And he said, "To be honest with you, it's not much. It is a flock of old, tattered, wounded sheep. But I believe if the Lord would send the right man to pour oil over them, that they could multiply."
Look at God. That's amazing.
When he said that, I knew I was going. And I got off the phone, jaw dropped, and Faith said, "What's wrong?" I said, "I think we're moving to Missouri." And she said, "Why in the world would we do that? We've never even been to Missouri." And I told her the story. She said, "Well, at least we need to go take a look at the church." Mm-hmm. And so it was like, I knew we were going to go, but, we had to make sure. And so none of this was coincidental. It was so divine for me. Yeah. So we were planning on going up there one day, and the night before, I had a dream that I was just walking through this church, and I didn't really think it was a spiritual dream at the time. But we're driving up there from West Tennessee. It's about a 5-hour drive, and we're driving up there that day. And I told Faith about the dream. I said, "I had the strangest dream last night," and I described this church I was walking through. Well, when we pulled up to that little church called the Webster Groves Church of God, it was the church of my dream. And so before we went in, I took the risk of sounding ignorant. I just asked the bishop, I said, "Before we go in, can I ask you a question? Is the carpet red in this church?" He said, "Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, it is." Well, that could have been anybody's guess. Every church had
30% chance, 50%.
Exactly, or probably 90,
Oh,
in those days. And I said, is there wood paneling on the walls? "Well, yeah." And I said, "Like a brown wood paneling on all the walls, no drywall?" "Yeah." I said, "Do you walk down a long hallway and then at the end you come into the back of the sanctuary and there's some stained glass windows?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay, this is weird. Is the back of the stage built with like square framing and paneling? And are there 2 PV speakers, PV, now of all the brands, are there 2 PV speakers hanging on the wall?" And he looked at me so strange. He said, "Yeah, why? Have you been here before?" Yeah. I said, "I think so, last night in my dream." And I told him the dream. And we went inside, and, he took our name before the congregation, and they accepted us. So that's how we ended up there. But it was a divine appointment.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I'll tell you the honest truth is when you talk about this, I think about so many young people worried about doing the will of God in their lives. Now, this is, at the ripe age right now, about 24, this is what I've arrived to. This is great wisdom. If you just obey what God says in His Word and you serve Him with everything you have and lay your life down, then you're eligible for Him to speak to you clearly and not miss it.
Yeah.
But
right.
if you start disregarding the basic things, that's where you start getting into trouble. But here you have an example where God could not have made it more clear.
More clear. And every major move of my life's been like that. I've never made a major move or decision without a clear-cut path from the Lord. Now, that doesn't mean that He told me everything that was going to happen. And every time it doesn't turn out the way I think it's going to. But it always turns out the way He knows it's going to. But He's moved me, even how He got me to ISOW. Every major move in my life has been like that. So, if I could tell young people seeking to find their way in ministry, maybe in life and everything, is don't do anything without seeking the Lord and waiting on an answer. Don't do it impulsively, and don't just use logic, and don't talk to unspiritual people and get your wisdom from them. Don't just go to a businessman because he's built a successful business and think that's going to work for you. But find spiritual people who hear from God and, seek the Lord and let Him reveal it to you, and He will.
Wow.
I'm living proof of that.